Praying for inner peace. When we are experiencing anxiety, particularly at the end of a difficult day, we should ask God for inner peace so that we can experience a restful night's sleep. Here now is Gene Getz.
Well, this is another principle from the life of David. And the fact of the matter is, he often faced slander. He faced lies about him. He actually faced physical threats on his life. And what we have here in this psalm probably relates to some of those attacks. For example, let me share a verbal attack that happened to David. And it happened to come from his own brother, his oldest brother. 1 Samuel 17:28, David's oldest brother, Eliab, listened as he spoke to the men and became angry with him. Now the setting is that David is still a shepherd boy. He's been anointed by Samuel. And Eliab was the oldest brother, and he was one of the brothers that was evaluated, and God said, no, this is not the one. And so Eliab perhaps is facing some rejection here, and he's in Saul's army. And so David, because his father Jesse said, I want you to go down and check on your brothers, he goes down there, and this is what his brother said to him. He said, why did you come down here? And then he judges him. Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? That's about a great a put down as you could actually make. He's angry at his little brother. It sounds like he's still angry, ticked off because he was bypassed as far as God was concerned and being anointed for the future king. And then he says, I know your arrogance. You talk about a projection. You know, we talk about projection. Projection is when we've got feelings and we project it on other people. And certainly what he's saying is coming out of his own arrogance. But he says, I know your arrogance and your evil heart. You came down to see the battle. Now, this is a verbal attack. And those are not easy to take, are they? I mean, in some respects, a verbal attack can be almost as painful as being struck, physically. Now, here's an illustration of a physical attack. And David faced this kind of situation. This is 1 Samuel 19, 11, and 12. Saul sent agents to David's house to watch for him and kill him in the morning. See, at this point, Saul was having all of these problems. Jealousy, rage. He had his own sense of depression, anxiety. And so he turned against David, who had really been called into his presence to minister to him. So he sends agents to kill David. But his wife Michal warned David, if you don't escape tonight, you'll be dead tomorrow. And that's not an exaggeration. I mean, Saul wanted to take his life. So she lowered David from the window. He fled and escaped. Now, it's this kind of situation that we see prompting David to pray, to share his thoughts with God, asking for inner peace in the midst of all of this. So in Psalm chapter 4, verse 1, here's his prayer. Answer me when I call, God, who vindicates me. You freed me from affliction. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. See, he's praying to the Lord out of the midst of rejection, out of the midst of threat, really literally on his life. Continuing, verses 7 and 8. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and new wine abound. I will both lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, Lord, make me live in safety. Now, the fact of the matter is that David didn't always come to the Lord in this way. This is a time in his life where he's really trusting God. He's really putting his faith in the Lord in the midst of what he's feeling, the threats and the anxieties. And it reminds me of Daniel. Remember when Daniel, probably at the age of 83, was put in the lion's den by an evil pagan king, who was tricked, by the way, to do that. But Evidently, in the midst of all of that, Daniel was able to go to sleep in a lion's den because God protected him. God answered his prayers, responded to him. And we see these events in the midst of some very difficult situations in the lives of some of these Old Testament leaders. Now, again, as I read a psalm like this, my mind goes to the New Testament, and I'm wondering if the Apostle Paul may have actually been meditating on this particular psalm. Now, remember, Paul was a scholar in the Old Testament. He was equipped to be a rabbi even before he became a believer in Jesus Christ. So he knew the Old Testament. He probably had memorized many of the Psalms. And so perhaps when he was writing to the Philippians, he was thinking about David. He was thinking about what David prayed and how God answered his prayer when he penned these words to the Philippians. Now remember, Paul was in prison himself when he wrote these words. This is his first imprisonment. He's not in a dungeon. He's in his own hired house. But he's still chained to a Roman guard. And he penned these words. Don't worry about anything, but in everything. I love those words. Don't worry about anything, but in everything. If you've studied logic at all, you know those are universal words. Anything, everything. That covers it all. Don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses every thought, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And that little phrase, peace of God, is very significant. When Paul wrote the book of Romans and came to chapter 5, he said, because we're justified by faith, we have peace with God. That means we're reconciled to God. We're no longer at enmity with God because of our sin. That's positional peace that has been established. Judicial peace, as it were, with God. We've been exonerated from judgment because of Jesus. But here he's talking about the peace of God. The peace of God because we have peace with God, but in the midst of all the difficulties that we may face, the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the stress, we can pray for the peace of God. And I know I've experienced this in my own life. And there have been times when I have been unable to sleep because of anxiety of one sort or another, something that has happened that I'm worried about or I'm trying to resolve in my own mind. And I remember there are times when I've asked my wife to just simply pray for me and pray with me that I can experience the peace of God. And it's amazing how God, in many instances, has come to my rescue by enabling me then to experience a sense of peace and be able to sleep. And by the way, if you're up all night and you can't go to sleep, it's certainly not going to help you solve the problem. We all need sleep. We all need rest. And so Paul is being very practical here. The reflection and response question is, why are false accusations so difficult to handle emotionally and spiritually? I think we've all experienced false accusations. And those are painful. One of the reasons for me is that it's attacking my integrity. It's attacking me in an area that really is saying that I'm violating my own values and what I believe. And none of us want to be falsely accused. And I don't think there's a human being alive that when you're falsely accused, you're going to have some anxiety. David faced that because he was falsely accused. So that's very practical to our own life. Another reason, it's hard to defend yourself. Because when you try to defend yourself, it can come across as being defensive. It can come across as trying to justify yourself, trying to prove yourself. And the fact is that doesn't come across well because even those who aren't accusing you sense that you're being defensive. So, it's really hard. Now, it's not wrong to defend ourselves, Paul did that. But it's difficult, especially when you're being falsely accused. It's much better if someone else defends you. But people, even who trust you, sometimes are led astray, and they begin to doubt. And it's very easy for someone to undermine your character and then to confuse those who never even thought about the fact that you might have a character issue. And that's part of the strategy. A rumor can be very, very devastating because it spreads. And I've experienced some of that, and I'm sure you have too. I think one of the most painful experiences I ever had was being falsely accused as a pastor. Found out later it was a conspiracy against me. In fact, one man literally went to prison because of it. I had no idea. This was a man that I had trusted totally and fully. And in retrospect, I realized that the conspiracy related to men that were out to get me because I was getting too close to their sin. I had no idea that I was beginning to get close to sin. And the best way is to turn that back on the person who's getting close to that sin and make them guilty of sin rather than yourself. And I didn't realize that. I had no thought that that could possibly happen with these particular individuals. And believe me, that was a very painful situation. And I remember that evolved into a very difficult situation when I was in the midst of this, fulfilling a speaking engagement in California. And I went out there with a deep and heavy heart, and believe it or not, I was speaking to a large group of leaders. And my subject was encouraging one another. And I remember sitting in the front row, and it was like I had lead in my chest. But it's amazing that when I got up to speak, even though I was feeling this heaviness of heart, evidently God made true in my life that strength can be made perfect in weakness, because my wife told me that she never heard me preach with such passion about encouraging one another. I was really speaking out of pain. But here's what happened. I started on Sunday, but on Wednesday, one of the leaders of that conference came to me and said, "Gene, I want to tell you, I want to have lunch with you. My wife and I want to have lunch with you and your wife." And they sat down and they told me a story. And they said, "Gene, we've been watching you. And here's why we've been watching you. Before you came, before the Sunday that I came, they said someone called the office, tried to talk to our head pastor, but the call came to me, and I took it, and the person on the other end of the line said, 'I want to warn you against Gene Getz because he's losing his mind.'" He's literally losing his mind. And he said, my wife and I questioned that because he's went on to say, "My wife was an editor at a particular publisher and edited all of your books, and this didn't sound like you. Something's wrong here. So we decided to watch you for 3 days." And they said, "We've concluded that you're okay. Something's wrong back there." Now, the beautiful thing about that was that God was protecting me, because if they had said to me, if they'd have given that story on the first day I was there, I'm not sure I could have made it. God was protecting me. And the other interesting thing is that in the midst of that pain, on the weekend before I began the ministry, I was reading in the pastoral epistles, and I was trusting God in the midst of it, and I was saying, "Lord, I'm concerned about my reputation." And it was like the Lord said, "Gene, it's not your reputation, it's my reputation. I can take care of it." And so I just turned it over to the Lord and said, "Lord, it's your reputation, it's your church. You can defend yourself, and you can defend me." And I saw as I looked back how God was protecting me, and God was helping to set the record straight. And you see, when God sets the record straight, it's really straight. But it's painful in the process. And to be able to trust God in the midst of that is not easy.